Hey gang, it's Squill, and in Season 4's Lady and Peebles, Adventure Time drops the bombshell reveal that Lady Rainicorn is pregnant. I'm Puppies? Not too long after, in Season 5's Jake the Dad, we are introduced to said puppies. Charlie, TV, Viola, Kwan, and Jake Jr. I've always found it very interesting the way Adventure Time handled Jake being a father. Usually on a TV show, a main character becoming a parent is treated as a big deal, with an entire multi-episode storyline surrounding it, or are simply treated as a major status quo shift. But in Adventure Time, Jake being a dad is handled rather casually. Like, it's a pretty big whoop in that first episode, with just how protective Jake is of his kids. But after that point, Jake moves back in with Finn, and things just go back to the status quo. The pups will continue to get at least a couple appearances per season, but for the most part, it's still business as usual. Jake doesn't really change that much after becoming a parent. It's definitely an interesting choice to have Jake's pups be such a minimal factor in his life, and there's certainly a debate to be had there about whether or not this was a good decision. So today, I want to discuss how the pups evolved in Adventure Time. But instead of going through every episode to feature the pups chronologically, I thought it'd be more fun to discuss each of the pups one by one. So let's start with Jake Jr. The interesting thing about Jake Jr. is that for Season 5, the season the pups were introduced in, she's sort of treated as the main pup. She is the first to speak, and the first one to be featured in an episode after Jake the Dad, with one last job and another 5 more short Grabbles back to back. But what's really weird about all this is that she almost vanishes from the show after this point. Her last speaking role is in Season 6's Ocarina. That's kinda crazy, right? She gets a couple non-speaking cameos after this point, but that's about it. I mean, it's not like she was ever that big of a character, it's just kinda wild to me how quickly the show dropped her. But through her limited screen time, Jake Jr. does have kind of a sad arc. As evident by her name, Jake Jr. is the pup that is most similar to Jake in her first 2 appearances. In Jake the Dad, her first words are "the manual's a bunch of junk," the exact same thing Jake said to his mom back when he was a kid. And in one last job, she has Jake pull off a heist similar to how he did when he was younger. She clearly admires her father's criminal past and is seeking his approval. However, by another 5 more short Grabbles, she has begun to outgrow her father, viewing him and Finn as much more childish than she is. Much like a lot of kids do as they begin to grow up, she started viewing her father less as someone to aspire to be like, and more like a kid in the body of an adult. And by Ocarina, she has become disillusioned with him entirely. It would have been nice to have a full episode about Jake and Jake Jr.'s dynamic. Perhaps a story about the 2 bonding over something would be nice. But alas, this is just about all she gets. So with that, let's move on to Kwan. Kwan has his first spotlight episode in Ocarina. In this episode, he buys the deed to Finn and Jake's treehouse, forcing the 2 to find a way to buy it back. There are 2 major takeaways from Kwan's portrayal here. The first is that he's a capitalist. He's always finding ways to do business with people. This obviously conflicts with Finn and Jake's carefree lifestyle. And that brings us to our second main takeaway, Kwan's desire to see his father grow up. Much like Jake Jr., Kwan has clearly outgrown his father maturity-wise. He doesn't just kick him out of his own home because he's a businessman. He does it so that Jake will finally get a job and stop living the life of a child. But when Jake takes every opportunity not to take responsibility, Kwan realizes there's no changing him and gives him his house back. It's a very melancholic moment, the realization that you can't make a person change, they have to want to change for themselves. Kwan's next and final major role is in Wheels, although this one is definitely a lot more focused on Jake and Bronwyn, who I'll talk more about in a bit. It is sweet that he goes to Jake for parenting advice. He may be business smart, but he clearly needs help understanding people. Although it's not as though Jake is particularly great at this either. We don't really know a ton about Kim Kwan's dynamic with Bronwyn, other than him just being concerned about her grades in school. He seems to be a good dad. He clearly cares about Bronwyn and wants the best for her. Kim Kwan's final speaking role is in the first investigation. He doesn't do a ton here, pretty much just assigning Finn and Jake with the task of getting rid of the spirit haunting Joshua and Margaret's old office. Finn does briefly question why he and Jake don't own the place, to which Jake tells him that Kim Kwan is a good businessman. That's about all I have for Kim Kwan himself, but I do want to briefly talk a bit more about his daughter Bronwyn. Although Wheels is her only speaking role, we can catch a gleam of her personality from her portrayal here. Like a lot of teenagers, Bronwyn is riddled with insecurities, pining so desperately for her friends to think she's cool, although she clearly cares about her grandpa Jake even more. As far as her interests go, it's obvious that Bronwyn loves skateboarding, but based on her skateboard designs, it's clear that she has a passion for art as well. Bronwyn's only other appearance is through a non-speaking cameo in Obsidian. Here, she shows up at the Glass Kingdom with Finn. Based on Finn's appearance with TV in Fiona and Cake, I'm sure he was the one to approach Bronwyn about going on adventures after Jake died. Although I'm sure she agreed to it in part as a way to get closer to Jake. She didn't get to know Jake that well, but befriending Finn is probably the next best thing. That's just about all I've got for these two, so up next we've got Viola. Considering she only has one major role, that being Summer Showers, Viola is probably the pup that I have the least amount to say on. She's a theater actress who auditions for the lead role in LSP's play. Despite knowing all of her lines and being able to perform them well, Tree Trunks is given the role instead. Unlike most of the other pups, Viola is consistently shown to respect her father. In Ocarina, she's the only one defending Jake when the other pups insult him. And in Summer Showers, she lies to him, telling him that she got the part in order to impress him. And in turn, Jake is 100% supportive of his daughter. Even when he finds out she was only a last-minute replacement, he's still impressed with her. But yeah, that's about all I have to say with Viola. Again, not a ton to talk about with her. Next up is TV. Out of all 5 of Jake and Lady's pups, TV is probably the one with the most amount of screen time, with 2 roles as the protagonist and multiple smaller roles throughout the series. The first time we see TV after Jake the Dad is in Jake-Su. It is here that we're introduced to his 2 biggest character traits: his laziness, the fact that he still lives with Lady, and his enjoyment of fantasy, video games in particular. And both of these characteristics are expanded upon in his 2 major roles. In the diary, TV finds the lost diary of Nurse Poundcake. TV becomes absolutely immersed in this book, to the point where he starts imagining himself as BP. This episode really shows off how into fantasy TV can get. By midway through the episode, he genuinely begins to believe that he is BP. His mind is only cleared when he and Jake do some investigating and figure out the rest of the story. On the other hand, Lady Rainicorn of the Crystal Dimension shows off TV's lazy side. In fact, the conflict of this episode ignites from TV's laziness, eating a sandwich that Lady Zed's boyfriend Lee was going to use to take over the Crystal Dimension. TV has a new best friend, named Lee. I'll be honest, despite TV being the protagonist of the episode, the story doesn't really say anything that we didn't already know about him. The episode does end with a status quo change, with TV living with Bob and Etzel instead of Lady. However, this isn't really brought up again. In the Come Along With Me montage at the end of the original series, we see that TV has become the new face of Joshua and Margaret's investigations. I suppose he must have been hired by Kim Kwan. Interestingly enough, however, Season 10 was originally going to have a full TV detective episode. The episode was guest storyboarded by George Major and would have featured Finn and TV trying to find out who's stalking Princess Bubblegum. It's such a bummer the show was cancelled before this episode could be finished. You can find the unfinished storyboards on George Major's Tumblr page. However, this wouldn't be the last time we'd get Finn and TV hanging out with each other, as the two are briefly seen together in the Fiona and Cake episode, Simon Petrikov. This appearance is brief, but like with Bronwyn, it's cool to see that Finn started adventuring with all of the pups after Jake's death. I'm guessing we'll get Finn and Jake Jr. next. We also learn here that TV enjoyed Ice King's Fiona and Cake stories more than Finn and Jake. This actually checks out given TV's obsession with fantasy, as well as how popular the Fiona and Cake stories were by the end of the original series. TV is also seen drinking with Simon at Dirtbeard Guy's Tavern in Cheers, except this time he has a traffic cone on his head. I wonder what that's about. Given how frequently he appears across the series, I think it's pretty easy to call TV the favorite pup amongst the Adventure Time crew. It's definitely hard not to love a character so dry and offbeat. But with that, let's move on to our final pup, Charlie. Charlie is the last of Jake's pups who we really get to know as an adult, getting her first and only major role in Season 8's Daddy-Daughter Card Wars. Despite this, she's actually my favorite of the pups. I don't know, I just vibe with her chill personality. I wish we got to see her more. In terms of what we know about her, we see that she's into tarot cards, which we actually saw a bit of back in Ocarina, so that's a neat bit of continuity. Naturally, Jake asks her to compete in a Card Wars tournament with him, which she does so in exchange for one of his bones, which she uses to see into her future. We learn that the older Charlie gets, the more lost and confused she becomes. This is until her 90s, where she is content and wise. Charlie fuses with her older self, thus gaining her wisdom, but it's unclear how much this actually prevented her bad future. We do briefly see her again in the invitation, where she is looking a little rough, but I don't know if that's enough to assume anything. But speaking of Charlie's future, we do know that she eventually has a kid named Gibbon. Not much is particularly known about Gibbon, other than that he lives to be the ruler of the Pup Kingdom in U 1000+, and that he has sort of a rivalry going on with the Ice thing. Based on Shermie and Beth's clear hatred of him, he seems to not be the best ruler out there. And those were Jake's pups. Most of them definitely do feel underused, at least to some degree. But in the Adventure Time crew's defense, these are 5 entirely new characters they had to write stories and personalities for. It's cool that the crew went out of their way to give the pups each at least one episode dedicated to them. But still, it's hard to argue that there isn't more potential for these guys. Like, we could definitely do something with Finn's relationship with the pups. It would definitely be cool to see what an adventure between Finn and one of them would look like. But more than that, I want to see the pups actually interacting with themselves. Outside of Jake the Dad, we haven't really gotten any stories about multiple pups. They all feel so separated from each other. Maybe they could do something more with their fused abilities we see in Jake the Dad. Or just generally get a bit more of their siblings' dynamic. I don't know, based on Bronwyn and TV's appearances in Obsidian and Fiona and Cake respectively, it's clear that the Adventure Time crew is still interested, at least to some extent, in doing something with the pups. I guess we'll have to wait and see if they do anything more with them. I await the inevitable cameo that one of them will make in Fiona and Cake Season 2. Please let me know your thoughts on the pups and which one of them is your favorite in the comments, and have a good one. Squill out.